15 years ago, Emily and her husband, Jake, were on the verge of achieving their dream, buying the house they had been renting for 5 long years. It was a modest four-bedroom home, old, rundown, and far from perfect, but it was theirs, or so they thought. After saving every penny and planning meticulously, they were finally ready to make an offer. Then everything fell apart. The kind, elderly owner who had promised to sell them the house passed away suddenly. Her children inherited the property, a group of extremely wealthy heirs who didn't care about promises or fairness. Just days before Emily and Jake could finalize the purchase, they were blindsided. The asking price shot up by $80,000, and the house was about to be listed on the open market. Panic set in. They had 5 kids, limited savings, and no way to scramble up that kind of money in a week. Losing this house could mean struggling to find a decent, affordable place for years. I was furious. This wasn't just a business decision. It was pure greed. And that's when I decided to step in and make sure justice was served. In a way they would never see coming. Emily and Jake weren't wealthy by any means. They were just a hard-working couple trying to make a life in a city where everything seemed expensive, from groceries to rent to basic utilities. With 5 kids under 10, life was chaotic but full of love. They had moved into a small, 4-bedroom house that was far from perfect. The kitchen was outdated, the drains had a faint but constant stink, and the walls had paint peeling in corners. But for Emily and Jake, it was home. The house was rented from Mrs. Thompson, a kind, elderly lady who had lived there most of her life and had saved comfortably. She recognized the struggle in Emily and Jake, how they juggled work, bills, and 5 kids, and decided to help them. Not only did she freeze their rent for 5 years, but she also promised that once they had saved enough money, she would sell them the house. Mrs. Thompson had a history of helping tenants this way, and Emily and Jake trusted her completely for 5 years. They worked tirelessly to save every penny. Vacations? Forget it. Eating out? Rarely. They even avoided unnecessary luxuries. Every spare dollar went into their dream of home ownership. During that time, they made subtle plans for the house. Emily imagined a fresh, modern kitchen. Jake sketched out a backyard play area for the kids, and together they brainstormed ways to make each bedroom cozy and personalized. The house, though imperfect, had become a symbol of their hard work and determination. Then came the devastating news. Mrs. Thompson passed away unexpectedly. Emily and Jake were heartbroken. The person they had trusted, the person who had given them hope and stability, was gone. Suddenly their dreams seemed precarious. The house had passed into the hands of Mrs. Thompson's 4 children, each wealthy in their own right, with significant property portfolios and investments. Money was not an issue for them. They had enough wealth to live comfortably for generations. When Emily and Jake first spoke to the heirs, the conversation seemed promising. Polite and reassuring, the children said that the sale would still go through. They just had to wait for probate to be settled. Emily and Jake clung to this hope, cautiously optimistic. Life went on in the meantime. They stripped old wallpaper, painted walls, and made small improvements. It felt natural, a continuation of the dream they had nurtured for years. Finally, the probate was complete. Emily and Jake were thrilled. Their hard work, patience, and sacrifice seemed about to pay off. But when they applied for the bank loan, their excitement turned into panic. The loan was refused. Confused and anxious, they called the heirs, only to be hit with shocking news. The price of the house had been raised by $80,000 without any prior notice. Worse, the house was about to go on the open market. Emily and Jake were devastated. 5 kids, limited savings, and a week-long deadline to gather funds that simply weren't available. It felt impossible. The city's housing market had been booming, rents had gone up sharply, and finding a suitable, affordable home with more than 2 bedrooms was nearly impossible. Losing this house could mean years of struggle and compromise, a life of financial strain that could have been avoided. Watching their panic unfold, I felt a mix of fear and anger. Fear for them, because they were powerless against the greed of the heirs. Anger at the heirs, who clearly didn't need the money and were exploiting the situation for personal gain. It was obvious they had planned this. The moment the probate was complete, they would either force Emily and Jake to pay up or push them out. It was greed in its purest form, and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. I started researching relentlessly. I looked up what made a house appealing or unappealing to buyers. I needed a strategy that could tip the scales, something that would make the property unattractive without giving the heirs any legal grounds to claim sabotage. Every detail mattered: the layout, the smell, the neighborhood, and the perception of upkeep. I wanted a plan that was subtle, clever, and impact began with the house itself. Rooms were rearranged to make spaces feel cramped. Furniture was moved from walls into the center of rooms, and extra items were borrowed to create a sense of clutter. Walls were adorned with eclectic decorations, motorcycle posters, and quirky artwork, making the house feel lived in, but overwhelming smells were introduced carefully. A head of cabbage was boiled on the stove, creating a persistent, pungent aroma. Ammonia was sprayed near doors, mimicking the smell of neighborhood pets marking territory. Rotten eggs were placed strategically in drains, producing a faint but unmistakable sewer-like scent. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, just enough to create discomfort for casual visitors. The neighborhood was also part of the plan. Friends with loud cars were recruited to drive past during the open house, creating constant traffic noise. Rugby teammates, large men with intimidating presence, gathered nearby for a barbecue. Even neighbors pitched in, placing old, moldy furniture outside and hosting noisy events. By the time the open house began, the property was chaotic and lively, an environment any potential buyer might find overwhelming. Despite the chaos, Emily and Jake worked tirelessly to prepare for the purchase. They contacted banks, reached out to families for loans, and did everything possible to raise the funds. The stress was immense, anxiety hung over every conversation, and every glance at the open market listing felt like a countdown to disaster. Potential buyers were baffled by the property. Some walked in, glanced around, and left almost immediately. Others lingered but were put off by the smell, noise, and perceived issues with the neighborhood. Every tactic was carefully designed to discourage offers while still keeping Emily and Jake's reputation as reliable tenants intact. All the while, Emily and Jake remained focused, doing everything they could to secure their dream. Their perseverance, patience, and planning had brought them to the edge of despair, but they refused to give up. And as I watched, it became clear this was about more than just a house. It was about fairness, justice, and proving that greed would not win. Finally, the day of the open house arrived. The chaos we had orchestrated was in full swing. Friends, neighbors, and rugby teammates created a lively, noisy atmosphere. The smell, the clutter, and the unusual decor did their job. And most importantly, Emily and Jake were ready. They had gathered the money they could, secured their deposit, and were prepared to act fast. By the end of the day, the results were clear. Emily and Jake were the only ones to make a serious offer, slightly higher than what they had originally planned, but far below what the heirs had demanded. Even when another potential buyer tried to outbid them by $30,000, anti-gazumping laws protected their purchase. The house was finally legally theirs. Years of planning, sacrifice, and anxiety had paid off. It wasn't just a financial victory, it was a triumph over greed and injustice. Emily and Jake could finally breathe, knowing that their home, their safe space, and their future were secure. The open house was only a week away, and Emily and Jake were on edge. Every day felt like a countdown to disaster. They had been blindsided by the heirs' greed, and now the pressure was intense. With 5 kids and limited savings, gathering the extra money seemed impossible. But giving up wasn't an option. The house wasn't just a building. It was the culmination of 5 years of sacrifice, planning, and dreams. Losing it would have been devastating, a blow to everything they had worked for. I watched them struggle and knew I had to act. If the greedy heirs thought they could just force Emily and Jake out, they were in for a surprise. I spent hours researching real estate strategies, trying to figure out how to make a property undesirable to casual buyers without hurting Emily and Jake's reputation. Every detail mattered: how the rooms were arranged, how the house smelt, even the vibe of the neighborhood started with the interior. Furniture was strategically moved from the walls into the center of rooms, making spaces feel smaller and cluttered. Borrowed decorations like mismatched ornaments and motorcycle posters adorned the walls. It looked lived in, busy, and a little overwhelming. But the goal wasn't to destroy the house, it was to create the illusion that this wasn't the perfect home that casual buyers were hoping for. Next came the smells. Emily boiled cabbage on the stove for hours, creating a strong, persistent aroma. I sprayed ammonia near the front and back doors to simulate a neighborhood pet problem. Rotten eggs were carefully placed down the drains, giving off a faint but unmistakable sewer-like scent. It wasn't dangerous, but it was unpleasant enough to make casual buyers think twice. The neighborhood itself became part of the plan. Friends with loud cars drove in circles past the house during the open house, creating constant traffic noise. Rugby teammates, many of them tall, imposing men, gathered nearby for a barbecue. Then neighbors got involved too. One set up an old, moldy couch in their front yard, and another hosted a noisy block gathering. By the time the open house began, the entire area seemed chaotic, lively, and slightly intimidating. On the day of the open house, potential buyers arrived expecting a quiet viewing. Instead, they were greeted by a bustling street, loud engines, laughter, and the smell of food, ammonia, and cabbage wafting from the house. Many people walked in, glanced around, and left almost immediately. Others lingered a few minutes but were quickly discouraged by the combination of noise, odor, and clutter. Emily and Jake stayed focused, quietly preparing to act. They had managed to scrape together as much money as they could, and they knew that timing was everything. Every visit, every glance, and every hesitation from other buyers brought them closer to securing the house. One particularly brave potential buyer actually stopped to ask a neighbor about the street. The neighbor casually mentioned that block parties happened frequently and that the drains sometimes caused minor problems. The visitor, clearly uncomfortable, left after just a few minutes. It was exactly the kind of reaction we had hoped for. The heirs planned to sell the house quickly to the highest bidder while unraveling right before their eyes. Meanwhile, Emily and Jake remained calm and patient. The stress of the past weeks had been intense, but they refused to panic. Their focus was on what they could control, making a strong offer the moment the other bidders backed away. They trusted that the anti-gazumping laws would protect them if they acted quickly, and they were determined not to let the greedy heirs take advantage of them. By the end of the day, the chaos had done its job. Most visitors had left without making any offers. The house seemed overwhelming, the street too lively, and the smells off-putting. Emily and Jake were left standing alone, ready to act. The stage was set. All the planning, all the careful orchestration had brought them to this moment. They were about to turn the tables on the greedy heirs and claim the home they had fought so hard to save. The week before the open house was a whirlwind of stress and panic for Emily and Jake. They woke up every morning thinking of the worst-case scenarios. What if they couldn't gather the money in time? What if someone else swooped in and bought the house right under their noses? Their savings were stretched thin, every dollar accounted for. Yet the heirs demanded far more than what Emily and Jake could realistically produce. Meanwhile, the heirs were calm, detached, and smug. They had no reason to rush, no fear of losing money, and certainly no concern for the family that had been promised the house. Their plan was clear: make Emily and Jake panic, force them into a corner, and pocket an extra $80,000 at little personal cost. Every conversation with them felt like a power play. Every phone call was a reminder of how vulnerable Emily and Jake really were at home. Emily tried to keep the kids' lives as normal as possible. Homework, bedtime routines, meals, everything had to continue despite the tension hanging over the house. Jake, on the other hand, was consumed with figuring out financing, calling banks, friends, and even distant family to see if they could bridge the gap. Stress levels were at an all-time high. Arguments were rare but tense, usually about the best way to make ends meet or whether it was worth trying to negotiate with the heirs. I watched them from the sidelines, furious and determined. This wasn't just about a house anymore. It was about fairness, justice, and proving that greed couldn't win. I began crafting the detailed plan that would tip the odds in Emily and Jake's favor. Everything had to be precise. The house, the neighborhood, and even timing. The first stage was inside the house. We rearranged the furniture to make the rooms feel smaller and cluttered, borrowing extra pieces from friends. Walls were adorned with motorcycle posters, quirky decorations, and mismatched ornaments. The house looked lived in, busy, and slightly chaotic. But the key was subtlety. It had to seem natural, not staged. Then came the smells. Emily boiled cabbage on the stove for hours, creating a persistent, pungent aroma. I sprayed ammonia near the front and back doors to mimic a neighborhood pet issue. Rotten eggs were carefully placed in the drains to produce a faint sewer-like odor. Nothing hazardous, nothing illegal, just enough to make casual buyers hesitate outside. The neighborhood became part of the plan. Friends with loud vehicles drove laps around the block, creating constant noise. Rugby teammates, imposing men with intimidating presence, gathered nearby for a barbecue. Neighbors joined in with minor chaos, moldy furniture on lawns, music, and chatter. The street became lively, crowded, and slightly overwhelming, a contrast to the quiet, orderly open houses that potential buyers were expecting. Emily and Jake worked tirelessly to gather every possible cent. They contacted banks repeatedly, hoping for a last-minute loan approval. Friends and family were called upon for assistance, but even with help, the extra $80,000 was daunting. Every hour felt like a countdown, every day a reminder of how little time they had. The weight of responsibility, both to their family and their dream, was crushing. When the open house finally arrived, the chaos reached its peak. Prospective buyers walked in expecting a calm, attractive property. Instead, they were met with loud engines circling the block, neighbor social listens, the smell of cabbage and ammonia, and cluttered, overstimulating interiors. Many left almost immediately. Others tried to act casual but quickly seemed uncomfortable, whispering to one another about the strange smells, noise, and layout. Emily and Jake stayed calm, hiding their nervousness. They had done everything they could to prepare. The anti-gazumping laws protected them as long as they acted fast and they were ready. Their patience and perseverance had brought them to this moment. Every hesitant visitor, every awkward comment from a neighbor, every unusual smell was working in their favor. Despite the strategic chaos, challenges kept piling up. The heirs occasionally checked in, calling to ask about progress or to subtly pressure Emily and Jake. They hinted that the house might sell to someone else if Emily and Jake couldn't meet the new price. Tension spiked every time the phone rang. Each conversation was a reminder that the stakes were higher than ever. Emily's anxiety grew when a particularly serious-looking potential buyer arrived. He lingered in the house longer than anyone else, inspecting rooms, opening cabinets, and asking questions about the drains and plumbing. I could see Emily gripping Jake's hand under the kitchen table, trying not to panic. The smell, the clutter, the street noise, all of it seemed to be working, but this one buyer was thorough and persistent. The NERB casually mentioned that the block occasionally hosted lively parties and that the drains sometimes backed up. The buyer raised an eyebrow, muttered something under his breath, and left. It was a small victory, but it showed the plan was working. Every other visitor that day either left immediately or quickly expressed disinterest. Still, the pressure on Emily and Jake was immense. Even as the house looked undesirable to outsiders, they needed to be ready to make a serious offer. They had to act quickly, gather their deposit, and sign the papers before anyone else stepped in. The stress was almost unbearable. At times, Jake felt like giving up. At others, Emily reminded him of how far they had come, that 5 years of saving and planning could not be wasted. By the end of the day, the conflict had reached its peak. The heirs were losing control, potential buyers had been discouraged, and Emily and Jake were preparing for the final push. Every detail of the plan had to succeed for the dream to remain alive. The open house chaos, the smells, the noise, it was all working, but only if they stayed focused and acted decisively. It was a tense, exhausting day. The house had become a battlefield. Emily and Jake were soldiers fighting for their future, and the heirs were the faceless, indifferent generals who underestimated them. Every decision mattered. Every delay was dangerous, and the smallest misstep could cost them everything. By nightfall, Emily and Jake sat in the quiet of their home, exhausted but determined. The open house had discouraged most buyers, the heirs were frustrated, and the stage was set for the final act. The conflict had reached its peak, the moment of decision was almost here, and the dream of the house hung by a thread. The morning of the open house arrived, with a strange mix of anticipation and dread. Emily and Jake woke early, with the kind of anxiety that makes every minute feel like an hour. They had spent the past week preparing, orchestrating chaos, and hoping that their plan would work, but now it was real. The day could either end with their dream fulfilled or completely shattered. Outside, the street was alive. Friends with loud motorcycles and cars circled the block, revving engines and honking horns just enough to create a sense of controlled chaos. Neighbors had joined in, setting up small gatherings, with music playing in the background and a few old, moldy furniture pieces scattered around the lawns. Even a local vendor set up a small food cart nearby, selling cheap hot dogs and soda, drawing a curious crowd. The street looked like a festival, not a typical open house inside the house. The smells were in full effect. The cabbage Emily had boiled all morning lingered in the air, blending with the faint ammonia scent near the doors. Rotten eggs in the drains added that subtle but unmistakable odor that made the house feel unclean, even if nothing was actually dangerous. Furniture was strategically cluttered, rooms felt smaller, and walls were adorned with motorcycle posters and mismatched decor. As the first potential buyers arrived, it became immediately clear that the plan was working. Most people walked in, glanced around, and walked right back out. The street noise, the smells, the clutter, it was all too much for casual buyers. Those who stayed longer grew visibly uncomfortable, whispering to each other, trying to make sense of the chaos. Emily and Jake stayed calm, smiling politely but focused on their goal. Every hesitation from the visitors brought them closer to the moment they had been waiting for. They had scraped together the deposit they could, applied for the loan, and were ready to act fast. Timing was everything, and they knew that patience was as important as strategy then. A particularly confident-looking buyer arrived, a young professional, impeccably dressed, clearly used to luxury and calm environments. He walked through the front door, sniffed subtly, glanced around at the cluttered rooms, and raised an eyebrow at the noisy street outside. He lingered longer than the others, inspecting cabinets, tapping on walls, and asking questions about plumbing and drainage. Emily felt her heart race. This was the one buyer who could disrupt everything. Jake whispered under his breath, "Stay calm. We've done everything right." They let him wander, pretending to be relaxed while I stayed nearby, watching the chaos unfold. Then her casually chimed in during conversation, mentioning that the block often hosted lively parties and that the drains occasionally backed up due to tree roots. The buyer's expression shifted subtly, a mix of hesitation and discomfort. He muttered something under his breath, walked out, and didn't return. Small victory number one. By late morning, it was clear that the heirs' plan was unraveling. Calls from them began trickling in, polite but increasingly tense. "Has the sale gone through yet?" one asked. Another hinted, "We might have other interested buyers soon." The heirs had assumed their wealth and connections would be enough to steamroll Emily and Jake, but they hadn't accounted for the chaos, the plan, and the determination of a family fighting for their home. Emily and Jake moved into action. With most visitors discouraged, it was time to make their offer official. They signed the paperwork, handed over the deposit, and applied the last of their savings to secure the house. Every second felt monumental. They knew that if any other buyer tried to step in, anti-gazumping laws would protect them, but only if they acted decisively. As the day went on, a few more potential buyers arrived, curious about the house, but none were serious. One offered slightly more than Emily and Jake's original deposit, but because the anti-gazumping laws were clear, the heirs had no legal way to accept the offer. Emily and Jake were protected. I could see the relief on their faces, but it wasn't just relief, it was triumph. All the chaos, all the smells, the clutter, and the neighborhood distractions had worked perfectly. What had started as a desperate situation with a greedy family trying to exploit them had turned into a victory finally. The heirs arrived in person, curious and frustrated. They walked up the street, expecting to see a smooth sale, maybe a few disappointed tenants. Instead, they were met with chaos, friends laughing and joking, music playing, bikes circling the block, and a line of neighbors casually observing everything. The house itself looked busy, lived in, and slightly overwhelming. Exactly as planned inside, they found Emily and Jake smiling, relaxed, and confident. The heirs' faces fell as they realized the house was no longer theirs to manipulate. Every tactic they had hoped to use, the threat of higher prices, the open market sale, their assumed advantage had been neutralized. "What happened here?" one of them asked, bewildered, gesturing at the street. "It's a neighborhood festival?" Emily smiled politely. "Just a regular day here," she said. The heirs looked around at the smells, the clutter, and the street chaos, and realized there was nothing they could do. Their plan had failed. By the end of the day, the house was officially secured. Emily and Jake had paid their deposit, signed the papers, and ensured ownership under the original terms that had been promised years ago. The heirs were left fuming, powerless, and humiliated. Their greed had been outsmarted by strategy, patience, and a little clever chaos. Emily hugged Jake tightly, tears in her eyes. 5 years of saving, planning, and hoping had led to this moment. The house was theirs, their home, their future. The children ran through the rooms, exploring every corner, unaware of the battles fought to secure this simple 4-bedroom house. I watched, smiling quietly. It wasn't just about winning a house. It was about justice. It was about showing that wealth and power couldn't crush determination, cleverness, and heart. The greedy heirs had underestimated Emily and Jake, and they had paid the price for it. The climax wasn't just a personal victory, it was a statement. A reminder that sometimes the underdog, armed with strategy and courage, could outsmart the powerful, claim what was rightfully theirs, and do it with style. The day after the open house, Emily and Jake finally had a moment to breathe. The house, once a source of anxiety and tension, now felt like a sanctuary. They wandered through the rooms, taking it all in the freshly painted walls, the clutter-free corners they had restored for themselves, and the small improvements they had dreamed of for years. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was the embodiment of their perseverance, patience, and dedication. The children were ecstatic, running from room to room, claiming spaces as their own. For the first time in years, Emily and Jake could imagine a stable, long-term home. The thought of moving to another rental, worrying about rent hikes, or struggling to find something affordable had been a constant weight on their shoulders. That weight was finally lifted. Even with their victory, the heirs were still simmering. Calls came in over the next few days, polite yet tinged with frustration. They tried to negotiate last-minute deals or suggest changes, but Emily and Jake were calm and unwavering. Legally, everything was in order. Anti-gazumping laws had protected them, and they had followed every rule perfectly. The heirs had no leverage, no way to reverse the situation, and no excuse. Emily's relief was immense, but it was also tinged with reflection. She thought back to the years of saving, the sacrifices they had made, and the anxiety they had endured. It wasn't easy. There had been days when she had questioned whether they could ever pull this off. Jake, too, had been stretched to the limit, juggling work, finances, and the emotional strain of potentially losing the house. But now, seeing their family finally safe and secure, all the struggle seemed worth it. The house itself became a symbol of resilience. Every corner held a story. The kitchen, once dingy and outdated, was now a bright, welcoming space where the family would gather for meals. Bedrooms, once empty and uninspiring, were now personalist and cozy, each child claiming a space that reflected their personality. Even the living room, which had been cluttered and chaotic during the open house, now felt expansive and comfortable. Every improvement they had dreamed of over the years was slowly coming to life. Friends and neighbors who had helped during the open house became part of the story. They laughed together, reminiscing about the chaos they had orchestrated. The motorcycles circling the block, the loud engines, the unexpected street gatherings, it had all been part of the plan. Emily and Jake often joked about it, realizing that the battle for the house had been a shared experience that brought the community together in a strange but memorable way. As the days passed, Emily and Jake settled into their new routine. The stress of the past weeks gradually faded, replaced with excitement for the future. They could finally focus on making the house a true home rather than worrying about whether it would be taken from them. The sense of stability was priceless. Financially, the situation had been tight but manageable. The deposit and initial payments were significant, but with careful budgeting and the occasional help from friends and family, Emily and Jake were able to stay afloat. More importantly, the home represented security. They knew that no matter what happened in the rental market or the city's housing prices, they had a place to call their own. Over time, the heirs' attempts to interfere dwindled. Their calls and messages became less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. Emily and Jake didn't need revenge, they had already won. The victory was in the house itself, the legal protection they had secured, and the knowledge that they had outsmarted people who had tried to take advantage of them. Emotionally, the resolution was profound. Emily and Jake had been through years of uncertainty, sacrifice, and stress. They had faced seemingly insurmountable obstacles, from the sudden death of Mrs. Thompson to the greed of her wealthy heirs. And yet they had prevailed. The sense of empowerment was overwhelming. They had taken control when it mattered most. using strategy, creativity, and determination. Then he bore hood. Once a backdrop for chaos during the open house, now felt like home. Familiar faces waved, kids played outside, and the community's support became a subtle but comforting reminder of how far they had come. Every time Emily walked through the front door, she felt a sense of pride that went beyond mere property ownership. It was a triumph of resilience, patience, and cleverness, looking back. Emily and Jake realized that the experience had taught them more than just how to buy a house. It showed them the value of perseverance, the power of careful planning, and the importance of standing up against greed. They had faced one of the richest families in the city and came out victorious. Not with force or confrontation, but with strategy, patience, and a little clever chaos. Friends often asked how they had managed it. Emily would smile and say, "Sometimes you have to get a little creative when life tries to push you out," Jake would add. And never underestimate the power of a good plan and a supportive community. The house became more than a home. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even when the odds seem stacked against you, perseverance, cleverness, and teamwork can overcome even the most daunting challenges. Emily and Jake had not only secured a house, they had secured a future for their children, a safe space to grow, and a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. Years later, whenever they looked at the house, they remembered the struggle, the tension, and the ultimate triumph. The open house chaos, the smells, the clutter, and the noise had all been part of a carefully orchestrated plan that had ensured justice was served. And every time they saw it, they smiled, not just because they had won, but because they had done it together, as a family, with courage, creativity, and determination. Now I ask you, so what would you do if you were in Emily and Jake's shoes? Would you have the patience to save for years, the creativity to outsmart the wealthy heirs, and the courage to turn the tables when everything seemed lost? Or would you have walked away, accepting the unfairness? Comment below. What's the boldest move you've ever made when faced with an impossible situation? Could you have pulled off something like this, or would you have let the greedy heirs win?
This was just one story, but the next one will be even more dramatic. Are you ready? Then you need to subscribe to HOA Stories 87 right now. Like this video, share it with your friends, and hit the bell because the next story might sound a little too close to home.